You are in the temple in Jerusalem. The air is heavy with incense, burnt fat, and fresh blood. Outside, the city still doesn't understand what just happened on the execution hill. But inside, among enormous stones, cold columns and lamps flickering in the dim light, something is about to disrupt an order that has remained intact for centuries. You hear footsteps. Priests move hurriedly through the holy place. Sandals scrape on the stone floor. The glow of gold lamps dances across paneled walls. The smoke rises slowly as if the air itself is holding its breath. And then it happens. A sound. It's not the sound of a door opening. It's not wood breaking. It's not a falling stone. It's fabric tearing. But not an ordinary fabric. A gigantic veil, heavy, sacred, separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the place where, according to Israel's faith, the presence of God lived in a unique way, the place where no one entered except the high priest once a year. Now before you, this veil begins to open from top to bottom, and that changes everything. The fabric doesn't sag like something old. It breaks as if an invisible hand was pulling it from above. The fibers snap. The sound grows throughout the hall like thunder trapped between stone walls. A priest freezes. Another drops the utensil he was holding. Metal hits the floor and echoes. But the echo seems small compared to the tear. Archaeological evidence shows that Herod's temple was a monumental construction, erected from enormous blocks of limestone, some weighing tens of tons. It was a place made to impress, to overwhelm the visitor with grandeur. But at that moment, the strength does not come from the stones. It comes from a tissue being opened. And here's what almost no one imagines. For those inside the temple, it wouldn't just seem like a beautiful miracle. It would seem like a threat, a violation, perhaps even the end of the religious world as they knew it. Because if the veil is torn, then the separation is broken, and if the separation was broken, who did this? You feel the ground shake beneath your feet. The light wavers. The smell of incense seems stronger, and for a moment, everyone understands the same thing without saying a word. Something died out there on the cross, and something was just born inside. The veil was not there to decorate the temple. He was there to stop it. Imagine being in front of it before the tear. You look up, and everything in you understands that there is a limit. Not a symbolic, light religious limit, a real limit. A warning woven in color, weight, and silence. This is where man can come. After here, no. Herod's temple, in the 1st century, was one of the largest buildings in the ancient world. Scholars estimate that its expanded platform covered an immense area, supported by retaining walls made from carefully hewn limestone blocks. Excavations around the Temple Mount reveal Herodian stones with chiseled edges, fitted together with stunning precision, as if the architecture itself said, "This place does not belong to the ordinary." But within all that greatness, the center was not gold. It wasn't the courtyards. It wasn't the crowds. It was the hidden space behind the veil. There was the Holy of Holies, the most feared, most protected, and most mysterious place in Israel. In the ancient tabernacle, and later in the temple, that space represented the meeting point between heaven and earth. It was not a visiting room. It was not a silent chapel open to devotees. It was the place of presence. And here is the detail that changes the weight of the scene. Nobody just walked in there, not even ordinary priests, nor do you levitate, not even kings. The high priest entered only once a year on the Day of Atonement, bringing blood, fear, and intercession for the people. Jewish tradition preserves the sense of spiritual danger of that moment. Approaching God without purification was not treated as a religious emotion, but as a mortal risk. Now look again at the veil. According to ancient descriptions, the temple veil was made of blue, purple, and scarlet thread and fine linen, colors associated with royalty, blood, heaven, and holiness. It wasn't a thin curtain flapping in the wind. It was a thick, heavy barrier crafted by expert hands. Evidence suggests that sacred fabrics of this type required refined technique, expensive dyeing, and materials reserved for environments of the highest importance. You are facing a border. On the one hand, human service, lamps, bread, incense, steps, priestly routine. On the other, absolute mystery. For generations, that veil taught Israel without saying a word. God is holy. Sin separates. Access costs blood. Presence cannot be manipulated. But when Jesus takes his last breath outside the walls, that boundary begins to fail. And the scariest thing is that no one inside the temple yet knows why. The city is too full to breathe. It's Easter in Jerusalem, and you feel it before you even see it. The sound of crowds rises from the narrow streets like a tide. Voices in wire echo, Greek, Latin, liturgical Hebrew. Animals being pulled by ropes. Coins banging on tables. Children running among pilgrims who came from far away to celebrate the liberation of Egypt. But on that day, liberation seems strangely distant. The sky darkened. Luke records that there was darkness over the land, and within the city, this darkness would not have seemed merely meteorological. Imagine being in the temple courtyard when the light starts to fail. The gold of the stones loses its shine. The white of the limestone turns gray. People's faces change. Conversations decrease. Someone looks up. Another squeezes the lamb he brought for sacrifice. And no one yet knows that outside the walls on an execution hill, Jesus is dying. Archaeologists discovered that first-century Jerusalem was a city of stone steps, drainage canals, and large circulation areas linked to the temple. During the festivals, evidence suggests that the population could increase dramatically with pilgrims coming from throughout Judea and the diaspora. This means that the temple was not empty. There was movement, there was service, there was blood being spilled. And here is the detail that makes the scene heavier. While Jesus gives his life, priests continue working. The routine doesn't stop. Animals are prepared. Knives are washed. Ashes are removed. Incense is offered. The bulbs need to be looked after. Religion continues to function even when the Lamb himself is outside, nailed to a cross. You hear the sound of sacrifices. He smells the metallic smell of blood mixed with the smoke from the altar. Heat rises from the stones. The priest's hands are too busy to understand what heaven is saying, but heaven is telling. Matthew writes that Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and gave up his spirit. Marcos confirms the scream. Lucas says the sun stopped shining. 3 testimonies preserve the same feeling. Jesus' death was not silent. She went through creation. Look closer, because in the temple, everything was built to maintain order. Separate courtyards, prohibited areas, defined rituals, sacred schedules, precise functions. Each person knew how far they could go. But at that moment, the old order begins to shake. And before anyone can explain the darkness, the veil prepares to tear. The tear starts at the top, not in the middle, where human hands could reach, not below, where a desperate priest could pull at the fabric, at the top. And this detail is impossible to ignore. You look up and see the first opening appearing like a luminous wound at the highest point of the veil. The fibers stretch. The fabric resists for a moment, then give in. The force descends, line by line, layer by layer. The sound is not fast like torn paper. It's deep, heavy, almost alive, as if centuries of separation are being ripped away all at once. A priest retreats. Another covers his face. Because that shouldn't happen. Archaeological evidence shows that the Herodian temple was built with monumental scale, architectural precision, and strict access control. The sacred space was organized into levels, separating Gentiles, women, Israelite men, priests, and finally, the Holy of Holies. Each barrier said the same thing. Only get as close as you are allowed, but now the last barrier is opening without human permission. And here's what changes everything. If the veil had torn from the bottom to the top, someone might say it was vandalism, an act of revolt, a priest, a group, a conspiracy. But Matthew and Mark preserve the most devastating detail. It tore itself from top to bottom, as if God Himself had started the tear. The light of the holy place touches the forbidden space. Incense smoke moves differently. The air that once seemed trapped behind the veil now escapes into the hall. You don't see everything clearly, but you feel like something hidden for generations has just been exposed. And the question arises before the answer. Is this judgment or an invitation? Because at that moment, outside the city, Jesus' body is suspended between earth and heaven. Blood flows. Breathing stops. The lamb dies in the same world where lambs are still being sacrificed. What most people miss is this: the veil did not tear when Jesus preached, healed, or raised Lazarus. The veil tore when He died. It was not teaching that paved the way. It wasn't the miracle. It wasn't the crowd. It was the delivery. Death touched the temple, and the temple responded. The ground shakes. The stones feel the impact. The entire system seems to hold its breath. And for the first time, the most inaccessible place in Israel is open, not because man ascended to God, but because God opened the way to man. The first thing the priests perhaps felt was not faith, it was fear. Because when the veil opens, there is no manual for that moment. There is no ritual foreseen for a sacred barrier torn in the middle of the service. There is no ready prayer for when the most inaccessible place in Israel becomes extinct, placed before human eyes. You're there, breathing quickly, feeling the smell of incense mixing with the dust that fell from the fabric. The hall seems larger and more dangerous. One priest looks at the other, but no one wants to be the first to speak. The hands that minutes before held sacred utensils now tremble, and perhaps this is the most human part of the scene. They weren't villains standing in a religious setting. They were men of flesh and blood. They had families. They were afraid of making mistakes. They had learned since they were children that God's holiness was not something light. Approaching required preparation, purity, blood, reverence. Excavations around ancient Jerusalem reveal a city built on layers of stone, canals, ritual stairs, and purification areas. Near the temple, archaeologists found many mikvahot, ritual baths used for purification before approaching the sacred. This shows that entering that environment was not casual. The body was washed, Steps were measured. Holiness had weight, but now the weight is out of control. The torn veil turns priests into witnesses. They no longer command the right. They watch the right being exceeded. And here's the uncomfortable revelation. Perhaps the biggest shock was not seeing the veil open. Maybe it was realizing they couldn't close it back. Can you imagine? Human hands may try to touch the fabric later. Maybe someone will send for help. Maybe they will try to make sense of the damage, to stitch it up, hide it, restore some semblance of order. But nothing could undo the signal, because that tear wasn't just in the fabric, it was in the system, it was in the distance. It was the idea that God would remain separate while man would remain on the outside. The metal still vibrates on the ground where it fell. The smoke continues to rise. But now every priest knows something has happened that no temple sacrifice has produced before. And the silence that comes after the tear is perhaps even more frightening than the sound, because in it, God seems to be saying, the path has changed. But then the question hangs in the air. Was God leaving, or was he inviting? Because at first glance, the torn veil looks like abandonment, as if the glory had left the temple, as if the sacred center had been violated, as if the place where Israel sought forgiveness had been opened as a sign of judgment. And there is truth in this tension. Decades later, in the year 70, the temple would be destroyed by the Romans. Stones would be thrown down. The sacrificial system would come to an end. Archaeologists discovered huge fallen stones at the foot of the Western Wall, thrown during the Roman destruction, still visible today in excavations near the Temple Mount. Those stones are silent witnesses that something ancient has truly ended. But in the moment of tearing, the message is deeper. It's not just God leaving a place. It is God opening a way. And here's what changes everything. The veil separated the people from the presence. The cross removed the separation. What was once accessed by one man once a year is now opened by a single sacrifice, once and for all. The temple said, "Stay away." The cross says, "Come." Do you feel the strength of this reversal? For centuries, blood was taken inside. Now the blood was spilled outside, in public, before soldiers, mockers, frightened disciples, and a city that didn't realize the size of what it was seeing. The saint was no longer hidden behind the fabric. The saint was on the cross. What most people miss is this: the torn veil does not diminish the holiness of God. It reveals the price of getting closer. God didn't pave the way by pretending sin didn't matter. He opened the way through the wounded body of Christ. The barrier did not fall because holiness became lighter. The barrier fell because the sacrifice was complete. Evidence suggests that the temple functioned as the religious, economic, and symbolic heart of Jerusalem. But that day, the center changed. It was no longer the stone altar. It was the wood outside the walls. He was no longer the priest before the veil. It was Jesus between the dark sky and the trembling earth. And when the veil is torn, God is not just saying it's over. He is saying, come closer, not with pride, not indifferently, but with broken trust. Because the path that no one could open was opened by the one that no one could stop. And perhaps this is the hardest part to accept, because it is possible to live with the veil torn and still remain outside. You are no longer in the temple now. You are in front of your own life, of your hidden guilt, of interrupted prayers, from the inner places where you still believe God doesn't want to enter, and somehow there is a veil there too, not made of blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen, but made out of fear, shame, failure, self-sufficiency, silences that you learn to call strength. Archaeological evidence shows that the temple was accessed by steps, courtyards, and well-defined boundaries. Each advance required awareness. You knew I went where I was, I knew how far I could go. But the human heart also creates courtyards, permitted places, prohibited places, areas we show, areas we hide. And here is what confronts you. The veil that God tore, you often try to sew back together. You say you believe in forgiveness, but you keep punishing yourself. You say you trust in grace, but you still try to earn acceptance. You say that Jesus opened the way, but you continue to stand at the entrance as if the voice of God is still saying, "Stay away." But the cross doesn't say that. The cross says that access was too expensive for you to live far away. Look closer. The tearing of the veil was not just a change in the temple, it was an invitation to stop hiding, to bring your weakness to the light, to understand that God doesn't just approach the clean, strong, presentable version of you. He gets closer to the real place. From the injured place, from the place you thought too unworthy to touch. The veil was torn the moment Jesus died because the distance between God and you was being faced in his body. And if he faced this distance to the end, perhaps today the greatest act of faith is not trying to appear holy. Maybe it's going in with fear, with tears, with the whole truth in your hands, because the path is open. And the question is whether you will continue to live as if you are still closed. And this is the point where the story stops being just about Jerusalem. Because the torn veil still speaks. He speaks when you pray without knowing if you will be heard. Speak when guilt tries to convince you that God is distant. Speak when your faith seems too small to penetrate the silence. The path is open, not on your merit, not because you managed to climb step by step to presence, but because Christ descended to death. And the moment he gave up his spirit, the barrier fell. Archaeological evidence shows that the temple was meant to lead the eye toward the sacred center. But the cross reveals something even greater. God has led the sacred center to us. And now the question is not whether the veil remains closed. The question is why so many continue to live far away. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to remember that God is not behind a closed curtain. And tell me in the comments, which veil do you still need to stop sewing in your life?